Record. Good morning, dear friends. Holy Yidden. Today is the 3rd of Adar 2. It's a Wednesday, March 13th. We're here to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Presently, Maseches Pesachim, Perek Shvi, the 7th chapter, 75b. Ayin Hey Amud Aleph. We're about to conclude the first Mishnah of chapter 7. Again, our Mishnah, our focus in a very, very broad sense is the appropriate method of cooking the Karban Pesach, namely by roasting. But what we've uncovered is that not all fires are created equal, or not all types of cooking are equal. And so today and yesterday, we've been focusing on an important question, which is, or I should say yesterday and the day prior, we've been focusing on an important question, which is, are coals considered fire? And it turns out that's quite a complicated question to ask. And we've noted a number of instances, or at least an additional instance where there is a necessity for coal, and that is namely the Ketoret. The Ketoret was brought on coal. And we had a brisa that we're trying to synthesize with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda, of course, is the one who says that the Karban Pesach on coal is acceptable. And we want to understand, does he see coal as synonymous with fire? What kind of coals are we talking about? And we're about to close out this discussion. Rava suggested that the use of gachale and eish, right? We're talking about the incense the high priest would use, and it uses gachale eish, coals aflame or fiery coal. And the brisa's question is, what would we suppose it meant if we would only have one of those two words? Without eish, what kind of coal are we talking? Without gachale, what kind of fire are we talking? And Abaye suggested that no one argues that coal is fire. The question is, can you have a fire absent coal? And Rava pushes back at the closing moments of yesterday's class, which ended early, so we could I could join my daughter in preschool. I want to thank y'all for your understanding. It was very wonderful. I don't know how they expect all the fathers to come to preschool in the middle of a workday, but whatever. Anyways, it's the new age, the new world. And of course, anyways, okay. So let's share the screen. Let's jump right in. And yesterday we were learning at yeshiva night, and the professor managed to somehow navigate, or maybe it was me, but I think it was the professor who managed to navigate even the Purim-related study to somehow touch upon our fire debate. Okay, now I remember how it was. And anyways.
Rabbi?
Yes, doctor.
Is it true that the new Jewish center that's being erected in our neighborhood will have a nursery school so that the rabbi will not have a conflict at being able to be at work and yet visit his daughter's nursery school? I just thought about that. It's terrific thinking.
I can neither confirm nor deny.
Okay.
All right.
The problem is, by the time it's going to be ready,
she'll be in college.
She's going to be already out of nursery school.
You said better than I thought. What I was bracing myself for you to say is that maybe my grandkids could go into nursery school. No,
you didn't. I said she'd be in college by then.
Okay.
No. Okay.
All right. Omar Rabba. And by the way, if you look in the original Shas, the Vilna Shas, so you have the text.
Rabbi?
Yes, Professor.
May I add to the discussion about the nursery school? A general observation that even though in old times the Jewish education seems to be supported by the community, in our days, most of Jewish education schools are commercial. And what I don't have small children, but what I hear from the people who do, it looks like this is a great impediment for continuing Jewish education, because the parents have a very difficult choice to make a great sacrifices, financial sacrifices, and many of them have great difficulties affording that. So I think that it's important to raise these issues that the Jewish schools should not be private, but they have to be community
It is a big problem
supported.
where today people have to.
I know. I remember the movie that you showed in the shul about the initiative of the rabbi that everyone has to learn how to say Shema, and children came, and it was beautiful. And everyone who watched this movie was touched because it was really very moving. On the other hand, the parents didn't pay for that, and this was one of the components of the success of this campaign. Today, that would be impossible.
It's indeed a concern. It's actually, I believe, a problem also in general society, because preschool is not included in public schools. So you don't have the same funding for preschool as you do for even
Right.
for other
Elementary school, yeah.
elementary school. But it's definitely an important note.
Mm.
Omar Rabba. This is Rabba challenging the way Abaya previously taught our comparison, our understanding of the Kohen Gadol's fire for incense. Ratza gacheles yavi, ratza shalheves yavi. You said that if a person wants, the Kohen wants, he could either bring a coal or a flame. Let's think this through. Shalheves beloy gacheles heichi mishkachas la. Draw me a picture. Describe to me what it would look like to have a flame absent a charred fuel. We could think of a hypothetical, or we could think of a scenario. He going to shafia lemona mishcha. He put a flammable material, oil, on top of a keli, the atli benura, and then he lit it on fire. Hahu lomli krolamuti. Why do we say that the Torah writes gachale to tell us not a shalheves on its own? We would never suppose that this is how the ketayra should be burnt. You know why? Hashta, even an ordinary physical human king, one would never try to light incense in his presence, in his honor, with a high smoke producing technique. Certainly, we would not propose, or one would never suppose, that this is how incense should be kindled in the presence of the Almighty. And therefore, obviously, any fire that's going to be used to burn the incense would be a fire that's anchored on some kind of coal or char or solid fuel. That's how I'm reading this. And therefore, this cannot be pshat. You cannot suggest, as Abaye did, that absent the word gacheles, we would bring fire on its own. Rather, how should we formulate this narrative or this process of gachale and eish? So Rava gives a suggestion. Ela Amar Rava, Taretz Hachi, here is how you should navigate this process. Gachale, if the Torah were to only write the coals, Yachal Oimamais, I would think that they would dafka be without visible fire. They are smoldering without eish. A whole lot of fire, a whole lot of heat, by the way. Therefore, the Torah adds the word eish to tell me that it should be loy chashois, flickering fire. But if you'll only use the word eish, yachol yavi mechse gacheles umechse shalheves, I might think that you would need to bring half coal and half flame. Let's just translate it, and then Rashi in a moment will explain. If you're going to take fire and then walk all the way till Gavoyi, inside the Holy of Holies, it'll yet all be gacheles. Therefore, the Torah writes, you should take a whole full pan full of gachale eish, flaming or fiery coal, from the moment that you take them, they should be already aflame. Now let's read Rabbi Stein's. Because what does it mean, half coal, half fire? Meaning that one takes coal from the altar, they should be burning strongly with a very visible flame. But by the time you enter the Holy of Holies, it will only be coal and no fire. Therefore, the Torah says, take a pan of coal that you don't need flames to be, you don't need flickering flames to begin with. It just needs to be a glow with fire. So you basically have three cases. You have the smoldering coal, which has no, I mean, four, but the fourth is nonsense. Nonsense is a cold, charred piece of wood. That's not going to be helpful. No one supposes that's what we're talking. So put that aside. Or real hard, or coal that's mined in Pittsburgh. That's all. That's coal. That's not cold coal. That's not what we're talking about. Okay. Now you have smoldering coal, which is it was lit up, but now the fire is gone, but it's very, very hot. You have glowing coal, and then you have a piece of wood when it's still leaping with flames. So which one is it? You may have thought it needs to be leaping with flames, and we clarified no. It just needs to be a flame. It needs to be glowing red, but it doesn't need to actually have those flames. And that's how Rava understands the balance of these two expressions. These two expressions for the incense. Why are we talking about incense? Again, we're really talking about the Korban Pesach. We're talking about cooking the Korban Pesach on coal. But to understand what coal is, we introduced the conversation, the other conversation, where we use the language of gacholim to understand what it means. And now we've clarified that gacholim mean a flame, flickering a flame. And that is considered fire. All right, now the Gemara asks a very interesting question. Menachem, you'll tell me if you're down for this. I think I've seen this in a few places in the Gemara, but it's an interesting question. Sometimes we might know the pronounced word or the conversational language, even if we're not quite sure how to spell it. I believe human beings throughout all of human history, and certainly at a time where not everyone was literate, you might have known the meaning of a word without knowing how to spell it. But it's curious and interesting to see the Gemara ask this question. We know that a smoldering coal is called oimamais. But how do you spell oimamais, this smoldering coal? Is it with an aleph or with an ayin? Reb Rafe, you're in Israel. Any idea what would you say how to spell oimamais? No. I'll tell you, we have a number of words that are spelled either with an aleph or an ayin. And sometimes they are synonyms, and sometimes they are very much not so. So you have the loy and loy. You have loy mit an aleph, right, which means no, and loy with a vav, which means to him. You have im with an ayin, and im with an aleph. What does im with an ayin mean?
With.
What does im with an aleph mean?
If.
Now, by the way, if you're listening on an unclear line, if
And
and
the other way, you got aim also, which is mother.
and then you have aim, but that's yeah.
Pronounced differently.
I'll tell you, my experience with the Gechalim, the Omemot, from what I always saw with an ayin. I never saw it with an aleph.
Me too. But you know what? We come after the Gemara seems to clarify. But from the conversation of the Gemara, it sounds like there may have once upon a time been a legitimate question. How do we spell it? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Harazim loy amamuhu began Hashem, began Elikim. We have a verse in Yecheskel, right, which says the cedar in the garden of Hashem could not hide it. What would be the commonality? Why would the smoldering coal have a shoresh that means hide, assuming that we're going to take Rabbi Steinsaltz's translation for granted, because what is happening in a coal that's no longer a flame? The heat or the fire is hidden, right? It's fiery, but you can't see it. So I suppose that might be the etymological association between dim, the absence of light, or hidden, as Rabbi Steinsaltz translates it. Let's look at Rashi. Arozim loy amamuhu. Loy hiko es marisoi. They did not dim their visage, their appearance. Lefi shahayam na'em mikol ilonis. The erez tree, the cedar tree, is beautiful or nicer than all the other trees. Hiram melech sor nemar, and this is a description of Hiram, king of Tyre, who was the one who was very involved in the building of the Beis Hamikdash. And so, based on Yechezkel, we have concluded that Oyma should be spelled with an ayin. And Reb Menachem gave testimony that indeed, in modern Hebrew, that is how the word Oyma is spelled. Now, this is it's a curious question. And it's interesting to see how we're going to use the Tanakh language to clarify a spelling for a word. Excuse me. It's not the only time we do this, if I recall correctly, but nonetheless, an interesting exercise. And indeed, now you'll take a look. I want to thank Rabbi Steinsaltz for this, or I should say, I should thank Safaria for this, but he flags for us that we had this question in Gemara Brachos. Actually, that's not really what I wanted to do. Let's do this. So many years ago, we were learning Brachos 75b. I want to just open up that Gemara for a second. No, that doesn't make sense. There's no 75b. We're talking about 53b. I just want to see if the commentaries here give any more. And now let's see if we can remember. We're talking about Havdalah and the candle. And so it makes sense that here we would talk about light and candles. Excuse me. Oh. Look at this language here. Just it's a companion teaching. Tanar Rabbanan, Gecholim Leichashois. If it is flicker, I'm confused over here. Loi chashois here is translating as smoldering, and oimois as dimming. It's a little different than how we translated it here, but let's go with it. So hechidami loi chashois, what would be a kol that's loi chash, which we described over here. Chisda says, if you're machnis l'soichen kesam v'delakas me'aleha, you don't necessarily see a lot of fire, but you put any flammable substance that right away it goes in flames. Again, maybe a slight distinction than how we translated in our Gemara, but close enough, let's say. Okay, the Rishonim there ask a good question. We're making a bracha on fire, it has to be visible, so what's going on, and whatever, he discusses what he discusses. And here's our Gemara, our question. How do you spell oimois? And then we have the same answer, but a different author and a different formulation of the same Gemara. So that's interesting. So let's just see. No. Do you notice the difference here? It's the same question, the same answer. Iboiluhu. Oimois, oimois. Tashema, Dom Rav Chisda bar Avdimi. Harozim lo ya'amamu b'gan alkim. So the answer is the same, but you notice the structure of the answer is different here. Here he says Tashema, and it's Rav Chisda bar Avdimi. And our Gemara is Rav Yitzchak. Actually, we can see it here lined up like that. So what's going on? It's quite possible or quite likely that the same conversation happened more than once. Maybe the version of the text was different. And that's a curious item to note. We're just about ready to jump into the next Mishnah, but now my curiosity has been piqued. So give me 1 second. I just want to open up one other sefer here. Let's see if he gives us anything on the matter. All right. It is what it is. Now, yeah. Let's see the new Mishnah. Or any comments,
Maybe they
questions?
just wanted to reinforce the answer, so they took two different sources.
Well, I suspect this question may have unfolded more than once. And so maybe we're capturing the dialogue in its naturally unfolding, the manner that it unfolded. So if the question was asked twice, the same, it's maybe they both had the same tradition from their earlier generations, but because they introduced it in the dialogue, maybe they're preserved, maybe it's preserved in their name. But it is interesting. I'm just looking to see if anyone else notes this. Okay, very interesting. Something comes up. And this starts to make a lot more sense, and there's a lot more intrigue. Take a look at Rashi again, and let's see if this makes sense. Well, actually, you see, it's really my fault. I was lazy. I took Rashi's word for it, even if it didn't sound right. And now I'm gonna have to pay the price. Let's take a look if it'll load on time. I'll have to close some, maybe if I close some tabs. Oh, here. So the verse reads, Arozim loy amamuhu began Elokim. The cedar trees could not be hidden in the garden of Hashem. And again, the coal that's Aimamois, the fire is hidden. Rashi says, Lohiko es marisoi, its appearance wasn't dimmed. Okay, that's consistent. And the last line is a little interesting. And this is a description or a reference to Hiram, king of Tsor. Now, I don't understand exactly why Yecheskel is talking, about Hiram, but okay. Yecheskel Aleph Gimel. So now let's just look at the verse itself. And it's going to be a reminder of how translations can be extremely divergent from one another, particularly if you are giving translations to the prophets where there's a lot of divergence. So let's take a look. Rabbi Steinsaltz translates that the cedars, Hashem could not hide the cedars, basically. I would have translated the cedars were not dimmed based on Rashi in the garden of Hashem. Here is the revised JPS translation. Again, bear with me. If this is not your thing, bear with me for a moment. Cedars in the garden of Hashem could not compare with it. Cypresses could not match its boughs, and plane trees could not vie with its branches. What's going on over here? Let's go to the beginning for a moment. In the 11th month of the first day of the third month, the word of Hashem came to me to Yecheskel. Ben Adam, Emerald Pari, Melchus Ryan, Belamoinoi, Elmi, Damisa, Bigon Lecha. Who can you compare in greatness? Hine Ashur, Erez, Assyria was in Erez, Belvanon, Yifei Anaf, in Lebanon with beautiful branches. B'choresh, Ugvakoima, Uvein, Avoisim, Hoisat Samrasai, beautiful branches and shady thickets. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, this is the story. It's talking to Parai, who's very strong. And as we know, there was a lot of problems, a lot of tension in the region between Assyria and Egypt. And the Jewish people were basically their punching bag or their tennis ball or whatever. And they were basically being beaten up on both sides. This is the verse that we've now encountered. Ma'im Gadlo, water nourishes. It's talking about the greatness, the flourishing of Parai in the moment, including with more description of how beautiful, strong, powerful, nothing dims it, etc. Now, some of the Mefarshim note that there's another verse in Yecheskel, Perek Chav Ches Pasuk Gimel. So now we need to take one more journey. Again, if this is not your thing, bear with me. Oh, we'll be through it soon enough. 28. Ben Adam Emor Linigid Sor. Tell the prince of Time. Koyamar Hashem Elikim. Yan Gova Libcha Vatoimer Elani Moshe Elikim Yashafti Belev Yamim. You're very haughty. You said, I am God, etc., etc. The Ata Adam Veloy Kel, and Hashem tells this king, you're a man, not a god. V'titein Libcha Kelev Elikim. And you think that you're a god. Hine chacham ata kol sisum loy amma mucha. You are wiser than Daniel, no hidden matter. And we're talking about things being hidden. So this is a conversation to Melech Tzor, the king of Tyre. And so Rashi tells us something about Melech Tzor. Some of the Mefarshim say Rashi seemingly is commenting on a verse that's talking to King Pharaoh about the king of Tyre. But if you look, there's another verse that maybe is talking to the king of Tzor. Now, if this is so, these two Gemaras are not identical. Brachis and Shab and Pesachim would actually be quoting two different verses. And if that is so, it would make a little more sense that it would be repeated in two different formulations with two different sages' names, because then these two Gemaras are actually not the same. So is it possible, and this is the whole point I was trying to get to, is it possible that Rashi had a different girsa in the Gemara? And if Rashi did have a different girsa, it would make a whole lot more sense. Both Rashi's language and the repetitive and slight divergence between the way it's presented in Brachis and the way it's presented in Pesachim. Take it or leave it, but there you have it. Rebbe Nachum, what says you?
I say whatever you say.
Okay. I prefer if you disagree than if you agree. Okay.
No, it makes sense. I mean, at least you attempted to explain it and makes sense. So why not?
It's our best try, or it's my best lead in the moment. All right, let's take a look at a new Mishnah. Now, as you know, the Korban Pesach is meant to be exposed to fire and no other heated surface or source, etc. Zok the Mishnah, Naga b'charsoi shel tanur. What if a mistake happened and inadvertently and unintentionally your Korban Pesach bumped into the hot surface of the earthenware part of the oven? And so your Korban Pesach was now seared by a non-fire heat source. Now, yes, the cheres is heated up because of fire. That's no good. That's not acceptable for the Korban Pesach. So you know what you do? You have to peel off the part of the carbon that came in contact with the oven. You can't eat it. Notaf miroitvoi al hacheres. Now, what if the Korban Pesach is dripping juices, gravy, fluids, and it dripped onto the cheres, the chazar alav, and then it spritzed back on it? I mean, is there like, I know what you're thinking. Rebel, are you here? Where's Rebel?
I'm here. Yeah.
So you're wondering, is there like video cameras inside the oven from all angles to make sure no gravy spritzes back on? Is that what you're thinking?
Oh, maybe you could tell it gets stuck to the side. I don't know.
Oh, maybe you can actually observe a difference in the appearance of the meat. But what do you do if that happens? Yitoil es mekoimai, that little space should be removed. Notaf miroitvoi ala soilas. Now, what if some of the gravy drips into flour? Yikmoitz as mekoimai. Now you need to scoop or pinch or take a handful of that stuff. So before we understand the distinction, I wanted to show you something. Do you notice that in each scenario, the language changes? What's the same is that makom needs to be no longer part of the meal. But we have yikloif, yitol, and yikmoitz. You notice that? Let's look at Rashi. Yikloif. Min ha-pesach makom shenaga b'tanur. You peel part that touched. As the Gemara explains that little piece of meat was cooked by the heat of the oven, the loitzli eshu, and it would not be classified as a full, proper fire roasted piece of meat. And as we noted earlier on, it cannot be anything other than direct fire. How did this shuman exactly get onto it? I don't know, but oil or fat can be more intrusive, expansive. It spreads more. Think about it this way.
Well,
if you're searing...
When oil or fat gets hot, it splatters.
Oh, so that's how it would be applied. But now we're imagining that the effect of oil or the reach of the oil is broader in scope than just a part of the meat that touches the surface. Let's think about it this way. If you want to sear your steak, or you want to sear something, the searing only happens to the parts of the meat that is actually applied to the hot surface. It does not, the searing doesn't spread. Maybe heat does, but the searing doesn't spread. But if you spritz or pour oil or fat onto something, it spreads past its landing site. And if it's absorbent, and I don't know if this meat is or isn't, it would also permeate inwards. And so Rashi is going to note that the reason why the Mishnah uses a distinct language for if the shuman gets back on the carbon, and if you think about it, it's removing more surface, it's because it's more invasive. Rashi, the loisagi lebeklipa, peeling the slightest peel is not sufficient. Ella binetila yafa ba'oivi. You have to extract and remove more thickness of the carbon. The shuman nivla b'soichai harbe, the fat is absorbed into the meat. And so what you're doing is you're cooking the meat with heated fats that was heated by the cheres.
Rabbi.
Yes.
There's another area, and do we have specific instructions of the korban itself can you put oil on it and stuff that would then disperse the fire?
I don't know, or for the moment, let's say I don't know, but what I do know is that you're not permitted to apply any other hot something. So for example, I think there's something called basting. With Alan, are you there? Can you tell us a little bit about basting?
Basting is when you fry something in oil, that you keep splashing the oil over the product.
And so basting is a manner of cooking, or maybe you're trying to affect the flavor.
Same thing with
Bringing in the
review.
flavor of the
The
yeah.
turkey. Bring it back up.
In other words, when they cook um, when they cook vegetables and meat, especially with garlic and everything,
Mhm.
they broil it, they fry it, and all the ingredients that are in the vegetables and meat are spooned onto the top of the steak or the meat
So you're saying it's
to enhance
primarily for
the
flavor.
flavor for sure.
Okay, so maybe basting is the wrong word, but my point was that there's also a certain potential cooking effect that occurs when applying the heated fats or liquid, but maybe in cooking, basting would not be so much for the cooking effect as much as the flavor. But here we're
Rabbi,
talking about,
I have a question about searing.
okay,
Is obviously the piece that touched the oven looks and probably tastes differently from the rest of the korban.
yeah,
But the
it's observable.
explanation, yes, but the explanation is that it wasn't cooked by the flame. But when we remove this piece, how is the underlying layer of the meat is better? It also wasn't cooked by fire. It was cooked through the heat coming from the oven.
So here's what I'll say. In the little that I know about cooking, and again, my brother is a big barbecue guy. There are people in my life that cook. I'm not, but if I understand correctly, there's something called a sear, and then there's a reverse sear. But no matter when you choose to sear your meat, there's a visible distinction to the site that's been seared. And so even if there's also other heat sources, here we're interested in exclusivity. We want exclusively being cooked by fire. And by the way, the Mishnah didn't say anything about that it's observably different. I'm suggesting that we can observe the area where it was seared. And I'm thinking to times in my life where I noticed that, for example, a burger had sear lines. And so I can know that that's the part of the burger that touched the grill or other types of searing. Anyways, but Professor, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but the idea is the exclusive form of cooking. Now, Professor, you may counter and say, Rabbi, but 1 second. Even if the visible effect of the sear is the site that touched, the heat probably does penetrate beyond just the sear site.
That's my question.
Okay. So then I misunderstood your initial question. I don't know.
It definitely does. It definitely does.
I don't know.
course.
What I'll suggest is
Searing,
probably the
searing is
length,
just burning it for.
probably the
Searing is
duration
just
of the
burning it.
sear determines the depth of the heat and the penetration of the heat. And here we're describing a mistaken touch. So I'm going to assume that because it happened only a graze, it's going to be limited in scope and therefore it can be peeled. I may be wrong, but that's my sense. So you have peeling, kidei klipa. You need to take a whole thickness, although the Rashi and the Mishnah have not yet presented any precise measurements to what netila means, removing the whole site. And then if it dripped into flour, you have to scoop out or pinch out the flour. Let's see what Rabbi Steinsaltz says. Remove a handful. Rashi, Mefarish begemara besoilas or tachas. We're talking here, says the Gemara, with hot flour, the matve roitzvay michoy masoilis, where the fat becomes more boiled from the heat of the flour of its sli, and so here what happens is the fat, this gravy has now been cooked by an added heat source that's not the tzli. And so you need to eliminate the fat or the gravy, not because of the concern of the flour or the concern of the actual fat, because that also has to be exclusively tzli. So we look at this as disqualified or damaged from Pesach. Mishnah continues. So Alan, this may answer, I think Alan, this was your question. Or someone that talked about the ingredients. If you smear truma oil on the carbon Pesach, is that acceptable? Im chavuras kohanim, if the participants are all kohanim, beautiful. Kohanim eat truma, kohanim eat the carbon Pesach. They're all tahar. Yoichelu, enjoy. Im shel Yisrael, but if it's non-kohanim, and now there's a problem where they could end up eating truma, and you're absolutely not allowed to. So im chayu, if it's raw, it hasn't yet been cooked. Yidichenu, you can rinse off the oil of the truma, which is a little bit of a chiddush because you're causing this truma oil to be lost, but you're salvaging the carbon pieces. Im slihu, if it was already cooked. Yikloif es achitzoin, peel off the exterior layer of the carbon wherever this oil would have been applied. Rashi, im chai, if it's right, the flavor hasn't been absorbed, the oil hasn't been absorbed into the meat. But if it's roasted, people mishum debola, now you need to peel it. So this is the second question or case of the Mishnah. The first case of the Mishnah is, what happens if the carbon is partially impacted by heat that's non-tzli esh? And we said it depends on the substance and the details. Oil that's truma, a kohen mustn't have it, a kohen mustn't eat it. And so we noted that then it has to be either washed off or... Now what happens if, excuse me, you smear the carbon Pesach with oil that was of a meiser sheni. What's the deal? What's the problem? Well, meiser sheni has serious restrictions about where and when it may be eaten. The good news is that this is allowed to be eaten and is meant to be eaten in Yerushalayim. So the Mishnah says, Lo yasenu domim al b'nei chabura, don't charge the value or the corresponding value of this oil, shein poidim meiser sheni b'Yerushalayim, because you're not allowed to exchange meiser sheni for monetary value. And if you would sell it, it may have an appearance of this exchange, but everyone can eat it. They are tahar, they're in the right venue, and so all should be okay. Rashi, basically, there should be no monetary exchange on behalf of this oil, but all is well. I should pause here for a moment because once again, I forgot to, when we launched our learning, I forgot to note that our learning is l'schus the members of the Chabura, and in hopeful, prayerful wishes for success for our chayalim and their safety and victory, and also that those who need to come home should be brought home and have a way to heal the refuas hanefesh and refuas haguf. And this is our new Mishnah. Now, we're going to have to explore a little bit more about what we might call Talmudic food sciences. Because, as we know, flavor is very much conveyed in Jewish law, or I should say Jewish law understands that flavor is conveyed in a few manners, but primarily through heat. And that's why, for example, if you put a bowl of milk in your fleshig, you pour milk into a meat cold bowl, you notice right away, you empty it out. The milk is kosher, the bowl is kosher, there's been no exchange of flavor, there is no problem. But if you pour chicken soup into your very, very dairy bowl, there might be issues. And so we're going to start talking a little bit about, again, halachic food sciences, about the manner, the nature of the exchange of flavor. This also may have relevance, the laws of Shabbos, where we also talk about the prohibition of cooking, and so what's considered cooking. But right now, that's not what we're talking about. Dalton's language, let's see. Based on the Mishnah, the Gemara introduces a general discussion concerning the halachis of forbidden food that comes in contact with other foods. And so we have the issue of cham l'toy cham. If hot food falls into hot liquid, hot mac and cheese falls into your hot chicken soup. Divrei hakol, asur. There is a unanimous opinion that this is asur. Cham l'toich tzoynein. What happens if your hot mac and cheese falls into a cold bowl of chicken soup? Divrei hakol mutter. Everyone says that it is mutter. Cham l'toich tzoynein. I'm sorry, I misread that. Cold mac and cheese into a cold pot of chicken soup. We're assuming that it's not very greasy and schmeary, but we'll get there. Everyone agrees it's mutter. If you have a hot item falling into cold food, now that's the hot mac and cheese into a cold pot of soup, or a cold mac and cheese falls into a hot pot. Rav Omar ila agavar. Rav says we always view the higher falling element as the dominant element. And so its halachic condition is all that really matters because it conveys and exchanges and it has the impact. Shmuel Omar Tata Gavar, and Shmuel says, no, actually, we're very much concerned exclusively about the lower item, the receiving dish. Let's look at Rashi. Let's see if his language adds anything, and then we'll decide if this is our point where we pause, because the Gemara is going to continue some beautiful analysis on the matter. So let us read Rashi. Ila agav. Rav says, ha'elyon noitseya. The higher top food prevails. Imagine this is a battle between the higher and lower food. Whose temperature is going to win, the hot or the cold? Rav says the higher element wins. Hilka, if something hot falls into cold, asur, then food becomes prohibited. The falling higher food heats up the bottom. And now they are both hot. And they have an exchange of flavor. And they absorb from one another. So now the meat has milk and the milk has meat, or maybe we're actually not talking about milk and meat, we're talking about something else. Let's hold off for a moment in the specifics. But if a cold thing falls into a hot thing, okay, now you're going to ask me a very good question, and I'm going to concede that you are correct. Until now, I was depicting a small spoonful of mac and cheese falling into a big pot of soup. And so it's very asymmetric in their proportions. And so let's suspend my specific explanation And soon we'll maybe be able to uncover more about proportionality and if that impacts. But assuming that you have two elements, so Rav says the higher element, temperature-wise, projects its reality into everyone around them. So if it's hot, it heats what it falls into. And Shmuel says, no, Tatagavar. The receiving bottom dish determines the temperature all around. Rashi, Hilka Chamel Techseinen. If something hot falls into something cold, mutter, because the lower dish cools off the hot upper dish. And if something cold falls into something hot, usher. Although typically we always follow Rav whenever it comes to matters of Isser v'Heter. In fact, we've paskin like Shmuel that Tata Gavar, Tanya Tarti Masnisin, Kavasela Kaman, as we're going to see, there are two Brisas or Mishnahs that reflect the viewpoint of Shmuel.
Rabbi?
Yes.
And what is the scenario when the cheeseburger falls into the chicken soup? Do we assume that it remains there, or do we assume that we pull it out and then ponder about the consequences?
So
And
I
if
was
it
having fun.
If it remains there, do we invoke the rule of 1/60th to this situation, or it's a totally different approach?
I'm going to have to get back to you, meaning we're going to see how this develops, and we're going to be able to build out a greater profile of what the scenario is. So, because for example, if I would pour a cup of milk into a cup of chicken soup,
Well, that it
top and
remains
bottom,
there.
they're going to be absolutely, totally commingled.
Yes.
So we have to understand what this scenario. And again, I'm not pulling this out of a hat. There's a very big discussion about lach and yavish. Are the items moist and dry? And obviously we're talking about a scenario where it does not become co-mingled. And it's simply a matter of one food falling onto the other food. And can the cold item cool off the hot item before the hot item can heat up the cold item? Now, I don't know what would happen in a laboratory. I could imagine that it would probably be a process where eventually they meet each other in the middle. And so I don't think this is a scientific question as more as a conceptual question. If a hot burger falls onto a cold, or let's say if an unkosher burger falls onto a kosher burger. Again, when we talk about kosher and non-kosher, it becomes a whole lot easier to envision the scenario. So let's say we drop a hot burger onto a cold burger. So the hot touches the cold touches the hot. Is there an exchange of flavor? Apparently, what we've noted in passing is that for a proper exchange of kosher of the two items, they both need to be hot. So is there ever a moment where the hot one heats up the cold one before the cold one cools down the hot? And that's really the question. And even though we might wonder if that ever unfolds, there is halachic food sciences, and that's the subject of our discussion. My dear friends, I have good news and bad news. The bad news is that it's 10:30, so we're going to pause here. The good news is, with Hashem's help, we will continue this discussion tomorrow, and we'll start being able to sink our teeth into it. I have another piece of, not bad news, but news that's noteworthy nonetheless, which is that tomorrow I'm going to have to end at 9:59, because once again, the women are going to be using our Zoom account, and as you know, ladies first. And so tomorrow will be a shortened discussion. So I also forgot that it's that time of month that we have the Rosh Chodesh Society, but I was reminded, and now I'm sharing that with you. And so again, tomorrow will be a shortened discussion. My dear friends, thank you so much for being along for the ride. Again, may we truly hear good news, healthy news, happy news for all of Klal Yisrael. Have a wonderful day. Shkoyach.